If you lived back at the end of the 1930s and suddenly followed the entire Second World War through newspaper reports from 1939 to 1945, what would have been the 10 most important moments of what was the greatest armed conflict in all of our history? Of course, everyone will have their own opinion, and today I'm going to tell you what I think are the 10 most important moments in my opinion. So stay with us so we can take this historical journey through the newspapers of the time, receiving here in Brazil the news about the war in Europe and also in the Pacific. Well, I start my list with the German invasion of Poland itself on September 1st, 1939. Can you imagine how shocking it must have been for people to read that once again Europe was involved in a conflict, considering that just a little over 20 years earlier, that great conflict we know as the First World War had simply destroyed a large part of the continent, right? So, people who were reading that newspaper back in September 1939, probably, a good number of them had also read the newspapers from 1914 and 1918. And the shock people felt seeing that all that trauma was starting all over again. And of course, it didn't come simply with an announcement of another static battlefront, like those of the First World War. The battlefront, opened in 1939, was extremely mechanized, fast, with integrated aviation and tanks being used en masse on the front line. And every day you know the remarkable advance of the German armored vanguards at a speed that no one really expected could happen. It must have been a very transformative experience for those who were following those events from such a great distance, right? Number 2 on my list is the siege of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. And why do I think this would be so shocking? Because we're talking about a very quick resolution. We're talking about just weeks of fighting compared to a British military presence that stayed on the continent for 4 years during the World War I without basically being able to move forward. And in just a few days of fighting, the German tanks, once again moving with astonishing fluidity, managed to surround the British Expeditionary Force and drive them off the continent. Man, that's basically a turn of the tide, right? It changes the world so much so that it really changed the perspective even of governments like the Brazilian government at the time, who really started to see that there could be a definitive turning point in European politics, right? Vargas gave his most fascist speech in history precisely in the days following the British expulsion from Europe at Dunkirk. Number 3 on my list is an event that happened just a few weeks after the end of the Dunkirk evacuation, which was the French surrender there in the Compiègne forest. Because you drive the English out of Europe, but you still have the powerful French army there to contain the German advance. But suddenly, what follows is the complete dismantling of the French front line, the Germans advancing with no one able to stop them and entering Paris, right? Capturing the French capital without the slightest resistance, holding their parades by the Arc de Triomphe, marking, really, what could become a complete and permanent German domination of the continent for the following decades. So, I can only imagine how shocked people must have been when reading this news. Now, for number 4, I choose the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, right? The announcement of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, because the fall of France had occurred in June 1940, and although we had the Battle of Britain there, right, which was just an air conflict that followed in the next few months, Europe itself, the war in Europe, was pretty much consolidated. And a lot of people expected it to stay that way, right? That the Germans and Soviets, who were together because of the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, would remain allies for a long time. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. And not only that, they opened the largest battlefront in human history, from the Arctic to the south, right? The far south on the Ukrainian coast of the Black Sea. So, what can we expect from the next few weeks of fighting? Will the Red Army really collapse? Will the Red Army somehow manage to respond to this German invasion, which also has the largest numbers ever recorded for a single invasion operation? So, I can only imagine how shocking this must have been for the people who were reading the newspaper. And how did this change the minds of those readers on the political left, right? Because many of those communists at the time had a good opinion of Germany, since they were together there through the Non-Aggression Pact. And from that day on, communists and Nazis became mortal enemies, for real, as they still are today. Next item on my list, number 5 now, the Battle of Moscow. Look, of course, Operation Barbarossa had already been going on for almost 6 months by then, so the Battle of Moscow might not seem like a big surprise, but it really was, man. Because just like every day, the newspapers reported the German advances until, they reached the Soviet capital. Of course, when they got there, everyone was biting their nails to find out what was going to happen, right? If the capture of Moscow, if the city fell, would lead to Soviet surrender, would lead to a change of government, would lead to a general capitulation, and to Germany's victory on that battlefield. Huge, right? So for sure, everyone was following the news at the very beginning of December when the Wehrmacht's advance units reached Moscow. And of course, no one knew yet that there were those 40 reserve divisions that would not only prevent the Germans from taking the city, but also push the Germans back up to 300 kilometers from the capital the next day. So I just sit here today imagining what it was like to read every day about the progression of those events and how they changed so radically, right? So quickly like that, the direction and the search for initiative in the war on the Eastern Front. Number 6 on my list, I think maybe the most unexpected of all, right? Maybe the one that no one could really imagine would happen. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. A Sunday morning, right, man? Because it wasn't enough that it was already pretty unexpected, but it happened at the most unexpected time, a Sunday morning. So the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, destroy the American Naval Air Base there in the archipelago, and bring the United States fully into World War II. And so a lot of people at the time might have already been counting the days, counting the elements that were missing for the Americans to finally enter the war, and what that would mean for the fight as a whole, for the forces, for the balance of power, for the Allied side, right? Especially here in Brazil, because at that time, Americans and Brazilians were already very close, including an American presence in northeastern Brazil, an American military presence in northeastern Brazil. So how was that received here in Brazil? I'm sure that a lot of people here in the country saw this news as a sign that Brazil itself would enter the conflict. If the United States entered, it's quite possible that we would enter too, because that's exactly how it happened just 20 years earlier in World War I, okay? So Pearl Harbor must have been really shocking, the kind of topic that no one else in your house, no one else in your neighborhood, or in your circle of friends would talk about anything other than that. So then, number 7 on my list, almost a year later, the Battle of Stalingrad. Of course, in 1942, several developments happened. Several very important moments took place. But none of them, none of them were more important than the Battle of Stalingrad. And why is that? Because today we know it's important, but why was it important at the time? because, again, it was kind of getting close to the end of the year. Once again, a decisive battle on the Eastern Front. And this time, a city that bears the name of Joseph Stalin. So once again, people must have been glued to the news, following the drama of the Sixth Army inside the city of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army. Later, Zhukov's counteroffensive, right, Operation Uranus, which cut off the Sixth Army inside the city, isolated them there. And how was that army, such an experienced, strong, and important armed formation for the German offensive plan, going to get out of that situation? I can only imagine how each day, right, the Germans' promises to maintain an air bridge and keep the Sixth Army supplied, and the Soviets' promises to strangle the Germans inside the city must have been like that, put in contrast in the headlines. And up until the final unfolding of that, at the beginning of February 1943, how those events must have been so striking for those who followed them in the press. Number 8 on my list, I jump straight to D-Day, right? On June 6, 1944. The Allies had already invaded Italy, had already deposed Mussolini. A lot had happened. Like I mentioned to you, the Battle of Kursk and all that, but I believe nothing could surpass the headlines of D-Day, right? Of the Allied invasion of Normandy. Why? Because that's what everyone was waiting for. It wasn't like something unexpected, but actually the opposite. It was something highly anticipated, right? It was what people were waiting for the most. And it finally happened. So I think that was exactly the people's reaction, right? Wow, they finally invaded through the English Channel, finally invaded the region of France, and now they're going to advance all the way to Germany. So D-Day, right, with all the magnificence of the logistics behind supporting that invasion, right? Which for sure provided several images, both in newspapers and newsreels. For the people who were totally focused on understanding what was happening, it must have been a truly remarkable experience in the lives of those who followed it. Number 9 on my list is the death of Adolf Hitler, announced on May 1st, 1945. The very end, the last 24 hours of the Battle of Berlin, the devastating Battle of Berlin. Why? Why is it shocking? Because people were following the news in the newspapers about the Soviet armies that were assaulting the capital of the Third Reich. So everyone was reading the newspaper every day. You can be sure of that. They were reading the newspaper every day, wondering how it was all going to end, right? Where's Hitler, man? How is this going to be resolved? Will Hitler be arrested? Will he be killed? Will Hitler manage to escape from there? I don't know. There was even the expectation that Hitler would escape from Berlin and go to the south of Germany, right? To the Alpine Redoubt there in the Berchtesgaden area. But on May 1st, because he committed suicide on April 30th, so the morning newspapers on May 1st are the ones that will report Hitler's death, right? So on May 1st, the whole world finds out that he killed himself there in Berlin. So that must have been shocking for a lot of people, for many who were relieved, and also for his many remaining supporters who read that news in the paper that day. Finally, number 10 on my list could only be the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. On that day, later at night, right? On the night of August 6th, President Truman announced to the world the existence of this super weapon, this ultimate weapon, which, by the way, used the force, right, of the universe, as he said, the fundamental force of the universe, and that it had destroyed a Japanese city with a single bomb, a single device, a single aircraft, right? So on that day, the world learned that atoms really could release that energy, which wasn't exactly news, you know? It really wasn't news that atoms could release a huge amount of energy. People had already been talking about this since the turn of the 19th, to the 20th century. And all the study of physics in this first half of the 20th century suggested that this would be possible. But in terms of engineering, really, in terms of mathematics and engineering, it was still considered by most physicists to be something distant. And suddenly, just like that for sure, suddenly, Truman not only announces that the Americans had invested billions of dollars in this project, but also that they had already created, tested the weapon, and already used the weapon on the battlefield. So it was really a very shocking piece of news, and I can only imagine that at the time, a lot of people didn't even fully understand what they were reading. They just knew it was very important. But it was in the months and years that followed that people discovered the true face of what the atomic bomb really was, right? And what happened during those events. And if you want to have the same experience as those people, you can read my book, The Atom as a Weapon, which will tell you this whole story from beginning to end, the development and use of atomic bombs in Japan. My book is for sale on Amazon and also on WeClap, but if you want it autographed for you, just send an email to warroomsaladagera@gmail.com, sending your zip code so I can calculate the shipping. So, do you agree with my list of the 10 most remarkable moments of World War II? You don't agree? Are there others? Tell us here in the comments. If you like this video, then share it with your friends, but also give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to War Room so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here and thank you again for watching, and best regards from War Room.